So moving on to the flexible fire barriers, again, they're flexible, non-rigid, and again can be generally used in all sorts of like retro and refurb, sort of hospitals, schools, for a multitude of different sort of areas that the product can be used in. Now, the integrity and insulation values can go anything from 30 minutes up to 120 minutes. And again, it's various different product ranges offer different scenarios. However, the coating on the outside of the product can sort of, the performance can go anywhere from 400 to well over 1,000 degrees. So again, it's very, very sort of robust product. And again, it's lightweight, easy to install. And again, it's very, very cost effective compared to other different boarding systems and that out there in the market. We often get a lot of inquiries regarding suspended ceilings. Now, there is no test standard for any manufacturer to test to. So this is always going to be an ad hoc status. So again, the best solution is to always fix the curtain to all substrates. In this instance, you'd fix to the side and the top. However, the only option that we've got is to have a 500mm overlap that just sits on the ceiling grid. So as the ceiling grid often will fall away, the curtain will just fall back down into place. We mentioned about the protected zone, very, very important. Again, ADB recommends that this is dealt with as stopping the fires going from one side to the other. Often there's a gap between the timbers and the batten and the roof tiles. And again, that can be anywhere between sort of 25 to 75mm. Just to sort of summarize, really, it's critical that you use the system components to make sure it's a fully tested compliant system. So it's making sure that you use all the collar rolls and the mastics and things like that just from the single manufacturer.
I've just put a little list there of very common modes of failure in fires generally. And I think if you look at any major fire disaster or even minor fire disaster, fire problem, you will be able to pick out 1, 2, or 3 of these factors that contribute to it. So lack of awareness of fire risk by management, people who are in charge of buildings, who are responsible for buildings, often their understanding is quite academic. They know it's one of the many factors they have to manage and deal with in their busy lives. And sometimes it's easy to push fire. It's not going to happen to us. It's not going to happen to me, and put it onto a sort of back burner. We often in the fire service encounter poor management of fire safety generally. Sometimes people don't know what they're doing. Sometimes they're quite deliberately not complying with their statutory duties. So it's a real mishmash, but that's a very common experience for us. When we try to enforce fire safety, enforce is quite a strong word, isn't it? And you'll find that the Fire and Rescue Service is actually a very tolerant enforcing authority. We would rather educate and persuade people to recognize their responsibilities and comply with them rather than go in with a big stick. So please don't be intimidated by me using the word enforcement, but you probably do need to understand that if push comes to shove, then we are an enforcing authority. And when we look at fire safety problems, and in particular in residential buildings and high rise, we tend to look at the whole building. We have this holistic approach. We don't just concentrate on facades. Facades is obviously the main focus of everyone's attention these days, but very often we find it's just the tip of the iceberg. When the facade problem is identified and we start to look at the whole building, we find lots of other things wrong. And sometimes, it can end up in quite serious situations. So if we were looking at a typical situation in, say, a residential block of flats, and we've got some issues with fire safety, I think the first question that the inspecting officer will ask is, looking at the circumstances of the case, is the Fire and Rescue Service the correct agency for dealing with the problems? You're aware that there's a Housing Act of 2004 enforced by the local housing authorities, and very often we will liaise quite closely with them. And it can often be decided that the housing authority will take over the enforcement action as opposed to us. It's very much a case-by-case basis. In the first instance, we would expect an inspecting officer or team of inspecting officers to discuss and negotiate a solution with those who are responsible for the building. It's not about us marching in and imposing something. We need to talk to you, find out what the issues are, and negotiate what is the optimum way forward. And the lowest response we can make is what we call a notification of deficiencies letter. We write to you, tell you what the issues are, and leave it to you to sort out. Because one of the things you need to be aware of is the legislation we deal with is self-compliant. So the law expects you to comply, a bit like health and safety legislation. And if you don't, you are breaking the law. And we're just there to sort of enforce that law. The next level of action is agree what we call an action plan. Now, this is where after discussion and negotiation, the person that owns the building or manages the building comes up with a plan of theirs, sort of self-imposed plan of actions with agreed timescales. And the fire and rescue service there is just to let you get on with it. But we've got a structure to what you're intending to do. I've got to tell you that not many fire and rescue services use action plans. They're an option. They're not mandatory. And because usually we find that we go through a lot of effort to help a responsible person create an action plan. And then we find it doesn't happen. It doesn't work. And we're chasing people. So many fire and rescue services actually go straight to the next option if the notification of deficiencies isn't suitable, which is to serve a statutory enforcement notice. Now, as before, this should be discussed with the recipient in advance. You do actually have a right of appeal. It's an important point to note. You've got 21 days from the service of a notice to appeal it, either in its entirety or any aspects of it. Fire and rescue services feel that they failed you if you have to launch an appeal. I suppose you could argue the ultimate power we've got is something called a prohibition notice. This is where we fully decant the building, i.e. evacuate it, everybody out. This is happening quite often in high-rise buildings as we're discovering the full state of the crisis and the built environment. It's our most draconian measure. In theory, we could serve a prohibition notice in most brigades in probably under an hour. It takes probably about that long to get resources there to do it. And it's only for the most extremely dangerous buildings you can imagine. We don't serve these lightly. In fact, there is for residential buildings an agreed national protocol in place whereby the Fire and Rescue Service triggers the protocol. A tactical coordination group will be set up. The Home Office and Department for Levelling Up Housing Communities will be involved. In fact, DLUC has a red hotline, 24 hours a day, manned, crewed, personed, because these decants can happen at any time of day or night when it comes to our attention. So there are sorts of checks and balances in this. It is very, very much a last resort. We will sometimes put temporary mitigating measures in to avoid a decant.
This is a bit about where we are at the moment, I suppose. Before Grenfell, life was relatively straightforward. We had building regulations, we had the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, and similar legislation in Scotland and Northern Ireland. And we had product testing to support our approach to ensuring we were using the right materials in the right locations. And after the tragic events at Grenfell, we find ourselves in a very, very different situation. And it has created a degree of complexity. I know not everybody agrees with me in this respect, but from my perspective, it has created complexity. For those of you who've had the chance to fall asleep reading the Building Safety Act, you'll appreciate just how long it is and just how complex it is, and the myriad of new requirements that it introduces. Things like gateways, golden thread, the building safety regulator, the construction project products regulator. We've seen requirements for fire strategies or safety cases as they're known, requirements in relation to competency, which has significant implications for training providers and certification schemes. So the introduction of a risk assessment prioritisation tool. We've seen continued amendment to the building regulations and approved documents, and I think we'll see that continue to happen. We've seen the introduction of PAS 9980 for the assessment or risk appraisal of external walls. So really quite a complex landscape in terms of the legislative position, and an awful lot for us to get our heads around. So, as I mentioned earlier, we've got a new building safety regulator set up within the Health and Safety Executive, and their responsibility is to lead on the delivery of a more stringent regulatory regime for buildings in scope, to promote competence for all of those involved in the building design, construction, management sectors, provide oversight for all buildings, focused on using evidence to better manage risks, which is interesting, enforcement of professional standards and registration of building control officers, and be the building control authority for higher risk buildings. So if you're working in building control, you're probably feeling this quite smartly at the moment, because there are significant changes to the way you operate and the requirements in terms of your ability to operate. But a safety case should really be similar to a fire strategy of sorts. Describes the building, describes all aspects of the building and how it works as a whole to ensure that the occupants or residents are safe. In particular, focusing on the safety from the risks of fire, the spread of fire and structural collapse of the building. And it has to consider how these risks are being managed effectively and demonstrate that that's being done appropriately. And it also has to show an approach to providing continuous improvement and a proactive approach to ensuring that risks are being effectively managed. In terms of building control, the Building Safety Regulator is the new building control authority, but the point I really wanted to make here was that individual building control professionals, regardless of where they're working, will need to have passed an independent competence assessment and be registered with the Building Safety Regulator. The timeline, or the deadline was set for this month, but the registration deadline has been extended because of the volume of work that is required to get yourself onto those registers. And you can see just in italics at the bottom some of the new rules and requirements that have been introduced for the building control profession.